take my mask off. Hey everyone, I'm Nicole Forbes, Den 7Ds. Today we are talking about pollinator gardens, and this is really the fall and winter edition of Gardening for Pollinators. This is not the typical time of year that we are usually talking about pollinators, and that's often because the discussion around providing for bees and hummingbirds and moths and other native and non-native pollinators usually revolves around flowers. And I'm still going to talk a lot about flowers today. A lot of the plants that I have here in front of me are either in the budded stage to be blooming either still late this fall or very early spring, or they are in full bloom at the moment, such as the fall bloom camellias. So really what we want to talk about this time of year is to kind of close essentially. You have perhaps planted a pollinator garden this year. You are working on attracting more variety of bee species. You've been enjoying watching butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, and pollinators in your garden and feeling the success of sharing and kind of creating a community and a habitat that both benefits you and your neighborhood as well as other species even. And as we go into this time of year, naturally we notice a lot fewer flowers blooming in our gardens, and we also see a lot fewer bees as it gets colder and wetter. The fact of the matter is that the majority of our native pollinators, and especially bee species in the Pacific Northwest, actually hibernate through the winter. So they spend the winter months either ground in kind of shallow tunnels that they are existing in as an egg or as a larva, or holes in wood, like holes in your fence wood or old tree stumps, empty hollow stems or branches of trees. And then, of course, we know of the hive-dwelling bees, honeybees and bumblebees, and the honeybees and the wasps and other bees that group together into more of a larger hive and make honey and all of that. But the majority of our native bees are actually solitary dwellers. Although most of them are hibernating through the winter months, they've not yet completely gone dormant or gone underground. So today is a perfect example of, kind of a typical fall day. It's rainy off and on, but there's no downpour today. It's just kind of the air is wet. The sky kind of feels like it's all around us in moisture. We have high humidity content, but it's also very warm out. This morning it was over 60 degrees, and the day's going to warm probably as we go. So our bees come out and are actively foraging when usually the daytime temperatures are averaging 55 degrees or warmer. So that means that not only have they continued to stay above ground and emerge when the weather, conditions are right. They don't come out in a downpour. A lot of the fuzzy bees get kind of wet when it's too rainy outside, so they have to wait for it to be dry. But warm weather, and they'll come out and continue to forage to either sustain themselves in the cold and leaner times, or they are still packing their nesting chambers with little bits of pollen that will be the wake-up meal of their newborn progeny, or their reproductive results. So they have eggs or larvae or a cocoon type apparatus that they have deposited into their nesting chamber, and they need to supply it with nutrition as soon as it emerges. And eventually then the bee will be able to go out and access food for itself, but there needs to be that early nutritional deposit that our native bees are foraging and collecting at this time. Now, the basic things to keep in mind at this time of year when you are considering the quality of habitat that you are providing for pollinators in the fall and winter are just a few easy things to remember. One is we want late fall and early spring or late winter blooming plants. We don't need to have plants blooming through the dead of winter. Having a flower in a snowstorm is probably going to not be visited by a bee anyways. But having flowers blooming as late as possible in the fall, such as our fall blooming camellia. We have this wonderful soft caress mahonia here that's got a nice flower on it, are perfect examples of late fall, late season bloomers. And then very early spring bloomers would be things like the sarcococa, some of our early blooming blueberries, for example, the heaths and heathers, our hellebores that are blooming in January, February, March as the weather warms up. So again, in the dead of winter, most of our bees are underground or in hibernation. That means that we need to consider their habitat, and we need to think about the fact that if bees are underground, what we put on the ground and in the ground can also directly affect those pollinators and those bees. We do advocate for organic and slow release natural fertilizers here at Dennis 70s, and especially for your lawn fertilizer. Fall and winter is a great time to feed your turf area, to feed your lawn. We offer a super organic, all natural lawn fertilizer that's not going to compromise the health of your overwintering bees or, the beneficial insects that are using that lawn space underground to spend the winter. So again, think about what you put down chemical-wise and fertilizer-wise. Secondly, the leaf litter. Now, hopefully, I guess, at this point, it's starting to sound like a little bit of a broken record to leave the leaves. It was a very obvious marketing campaign that was, creatively thought up and has been kind of, promoted as a way to not only have a smaller carbon footprint. I mean, if we rake up leaves and send them off to our yard debris service and have them collected and dumped in a municipal composting facility only in spring to usually call up the soil supplier and ask for a nice load of compost or mulch to be delivered back to our homes for us to spread and beautify our gardens, leaving the leaves allows us to keep that biomass, keep that material on site, and use it in our own gardens, not either as, selectively placed mulches or as a natural ground covering that not only competes and chokes out weeds, holds in moisture, and underneath and inside this leaf layer is where a lot of our moth and butterfly larvae have been deposited to again use that fluffy, loose layer of leaf mold as protection, and they will emerge in the spring as a butterfly or a moth or other beneficial beetles are in there, all kinds of beneficial pollinators. So if we rake them up and send them packing, again, we look around in the spring and wonder where all the butterflies are. There's your answer. I'm not advocating for letting the leaves fall everywhere you would be walking, for example. Fallen and wet, decomposing, slimy leaves can be very slippery and can cause a lot of accidents. I just had a good friend have a fall on slippery, wet leaves and got fairly injured. So on your walkways, on your decks, on your driveway, for example, you're probably not going to have a lot of butterfly larvae deposited on the leaf layer in your driveway. So you can go ahead and rake off those surfaces for safety. But in my garden, I rake the driveway off onto my hedgerow that is the planting, that is the kind of perimeter garden between me and my neighbors. So I have series of large shrubs and trees and some perennials in kind of that strip between properties off my driveway. And it's a perfect opportunity to just rake those leaves into the underspace underneath all the shrubs to allow them to decompose on their own slowly and over time. And it's a very rich, loose layer at this point of leaf mold that I can both collect and spread in further places of my garden, or I never have to weed this space because of the nice layer of leaves. Now, if you have leaves that you don't want to leave on, for example, your lawn, really big leaves or a very heavy wet layer of leaves can meld together basically and create a situation where the lawn can rot underneath. And so if you don't want that kind of thing, you can again rake the leaves onto your garden beds, perennial beds, areas where you aren't actively growing things at the moment, or even collect the leaves into piles themselves, just loose piles, or you can make little metal, like chicken wire type cylinders and put your leaves all in there. Over a very short amount of time, that great big pile or that big cylinder of leaves actually will decompose and drop down. So if you think you have a big full container of it, pretty quickly you'll see that the level decreases by a quarter, and by spring it'll probably have decreased by half in decomposition. So then you'll either be able to turn it, use it, or add more to the top of it as you're cleaning up and raking leaves for the spring. In addition to leaving the leaves, allowing for a slightly unkempt, messy, small corner of your garden. It can be in the back, behind other plants. Ideally, you've got a little bit of sunshine there, so most pollinators need the sun to warm up and be active. And so this wouldn't be a shady space, but a tiny little patch of sun in the back section of your garden that you leave a little messy, could have weeds in it. It could be unmowed, even some bare ground. And that bare, undisturbed ground is perfect conditions for a lot of our little burrowing or digger bees, the minor bees, also called adrena bees. Small little guys that often when I'm gardening, pulling weeds and things, I seem to, maybe accidentally pull up one. I see them kind of, crawl around on the surface of the soil looking a little bit like I just woke them up and they're disoriented, and then eventually they go right back into their little holes. Now, these types of bees that we might run into are, again, they're solitary. They are, if they aren't hibernating underground, that's also where they live. So, just because I'm home doesn't mean that I'm always asleep. They could just be in their little hole because they're not out foraging at the moment. So, when you disturb them, again, we just want to leave them alone and let them go back to their little spaces. Those types of bees don't do active damage to homes or to like our lawns. Their little burrows don't damage lawns. In fact, in many cases, that little burrow that the bees make can help aerate the lawn surface as well. So when I sit out in my garden, and especially in the kind of wild patch of my lawn, I have allowed dandelions to grow in my lawn. And although I have here a lot of ornamental and some native landscape plants, probably one of the most important of our weed patch plants for our native bees and pollinators are dandelions. So you already have, in many cases, the very answer to what are my early emerging bees going to eat, because dandelions are like one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring. Often even in late winter, the first dandelion flower blooms. And if you watch those dandelion flowers, they are never alone. They are always buzzing with all kinds of early bee and pollinator activity. So in addition to what you can purchase and plant in your garden, in many cases just allowing a small patch of weeds that you can control. I'm not saying let dandelions take over the world. You can mow them before they go to seed, for example, but allowing those dandelions to be foraged by our early emerging pollinators is also extremely important. So leave the leaves, keep a small patch. 3 by 3 is fine, you know, a little 3 foot by 3 foot patch of messy earth or bare earth for pollinators. And then finally, before we get into all the plants, wait, if possible, until spring to really cut back all of your perennials, to do a lot of shrub trimming and those kinds of things, because as a stem dies back, you'll have a little bit of decay perhaps in a stem, and if it's hollow, that creates a perfect environment for a little critter to crawl in, maybe seal up the end with its, you know, a patch of mud or a little bit of chewed leaf, and to just kind of snuggle down and spend the winter in that hollow branch or hollow stem. Again, if we snip it off unknowingly and toss it off into the compost bin, then we've also just eliminated those pollinators from our garden. If you do need to do a lot of fall cleanup or putting your garden to bed for this time of year, and we're going to talk more about this next week, then at least cut back above ground to about 12 inches of, like, allow the plant to remain at least 12 inches above ground. And that 12 inches will still leave enough room for some habitat or some nesting chambers for some of our beneficials. Down to the plants that, as usual, this video has a handout blog article attached. You can find it as a link up at the top of the video, right below the description. If anyone has any problems or issues finding the info, please just post a comment and we'll make sure to make it easy for you to access. There's lists on the handout of trees, shrubs, perennials, etc., I think, that provide us with this late fall or early spring blooming window that is not a abundantly blooming time of year. We don't have a lot of flowers out at that time of year. And we think a lot of times when we think about pollinators, we know that our apples and our cherries, our fruit trees, our nuts, our blueberries, they all need to be pollinated. And when we think about spring blooming trees, for example, often those are the first things that come into our mind, the, coveted cherry blossoms, or how beautiful it is to see the almonds in bloom. Now, those are, of course, great food supply for our early pollinators, but in addition, there are other trees that bloom in late winter or early spring that are not showy at all, and we don't even really think about them as a flowering tree. But honestly, like, pretty much everything flowers, or there's no way that it could reproduce. It's like, pretty much everybody has sex, even though we don't like to think about it. But if they didn't, we wouldn't be a species that is continued to thrive to this day. So blooming may not be one of those things that we're like, oh, marveling at the beauty of this flower, but that does not limit its attractiveness necessarily to pollinators. So bees use nectar as an energy source. Excuse me. Bees use carbohydrates from flower nectar and protein from pollen inside flowers as their food source. So some flowers provide both nectar and pollen. Some only provide one or the other for bees. And some flowers have been hybridized or bred to be more attractive to humans and consequentially, but not intentionally, less attractive to pollinators. The more complicated the flower form in many cases, the more petals, the double flowering forms are often visited less frequently by pollinators. They're just too complicated for the bees to get into and to find the pollen and the nectar sources. In some cases, they aren't even physically able any longer to access the goods because of a lengthened nectar tube or a other physical change that we have created within the plant to cause it to make a bigger bloom or a double bloom or whatever it is. So just as an example of single and double flowers, I have here 2 winter blooming camellias, and one here is a single. The white one is Setsugeka, looks like a fried egg, and of course easily viewed in the middle is all of the reproductive parts in the center of the flower that are just loaded with pollen. I've got my pollen on my finger even just from touching them. Now this flower is Jean May, I think. I don't even remember which one I took it off of. But this is an example of a semi-double camellia flower. And rather than being single and seeing it like a fried egg, all that center yellow, we have some petals that obscure the center. Now this is semi-double. So a double flowering camellia has even more petals in the center, looks more like a full classic rose flower, for example. And in many cases, you can't see that center yellow or any of the reproductive parts of the plant whatsoever. So it's as if as the flower gets more and more and more complicated, it's got less and less and less appeal to pollinators. Now the opposite of a complicated flower is an easy flower, and a perfect example of an easy flower is a bell shape. So a bell-shaped flower is basically the Ericaceae family. So Ericaceae flowering plants are heaths and heathers, are our arbutus, Mahonia, vaccinium, all of the blueberry family, and Ericaceae flowers small in their opening, which limits which bees can get inside and favors smaller native pollinators over great big bumblebees or even the larger European honeybees. So this is one of the trees that blooms in the winter. It's almost constantly in bloom, which is a great one for our native pollinators or winter pollinator gardens. It's little pendulous bell-shaped, and in many cases, you can see over here, I don't know if you can really see, its flowers eventually age to a pink kind of cluster up here. So this is Arbutus marina, and it's a variety of strawberry tree. The beautiful pendulous flowers can be white, and then eventually they tinge to pink, blooming this time of year, and will also form a little fruit, a kind of strawberry looking fruit that then songbirds and squirrels eat. But this is an evergreen that is related. Oh, and you see that cool kind of peely bark that we see on there, kind of shaggy peely bark. It gets sort of red and pretty. So this is related to manzanitas and madrones. And those are also great plants for early spring or late winter blooms, the manzanitas and madrones. And then that same family includes some of our natives, such as the Arctostaphylos, also known as kinnikinnick or bearberry. So kinnikinnick is a great low-growing ground cover type plant. And right now it's forming its flower buds, but they're like tight little hooks that are still just kind of curled up at the ends of the branches. Now anything that blooms either in late winter or early spring already has its flower buds out. So everything that we're looking at now is blooming on previous year's wood. Now that goes back to, again, kind of a pruning. It's just a word on pruning, I guess. If we prune at this time of year, on those early bloomers, we'll be pruning off their flower buds. So another reason to have very limited pruning at this time of year is that if you don't know when it blooms or can't recognize flower buds sitting there, avoid cutting anything so that you don't accidentally cut flower buds off. Now, maple trees, here in the Pacific Northwest, we have our big leaf maple trees. We have lots of Acer rubrum or silver maple or Norway maples as ornamental or street trees. Then many of us in our gardens have native vine maples and the smaller, more ornamental Japanese maples. Maples bloom. I bet you've never thought about a maple flower, but maples bloom in late winter, usually before the leaves come out or right as the leaves are emerging. And the flowers form also critical food supply for our native pollinators. They are flowering at about the same time as the earliest of the bees are emerging. Here I have a beautiful vine maple that is a cultivar of our natives. So this is Pacific Fire vine maple, and it's grown more for these kind of red stems that it gets as it gets colder and drops its leaves, similar to the coral bark Japanese maple. So Acer circinatum in general are native vine maples, great for that early bloom and for something a little more of a cultivar of that native Pacific Fire. Willows, fantastic flower that comes on early season. Often willows are in bloom even in January, depending on the, the year itself or what kind of winter we have. And hazelnuts. So, kind of the Oregon cash crop that's been around forever are standard hazelnuts. And if you've got any of the contorted hazelnuts, for example, the Harry Lauder's walking stick, wonderful little catkins that are formed in late winter that open with lots and lots of pollen in them, are kind of one of the floral attributes of the plant in general. So thinking about things that are maybe a little less obvious to the human eye as far as a flower is concerned, but certainly nonetheless attractive to the bees. Shrubs, same thing goes. Some of the earliest blooming shrubs, well, we turn to our native plants. So of course, Oregon grape, our state plant. Here I have our standard Mahonia aquifolium. Now you'll see on your handout Berberis / Mahonia, and that's because science is always improving on itself and time marches on. And that means that the category of genus commonly referred to as Mahonia in the past has been split up and reclassified, and the Mahonia aquifolium, known as our Oregon grape, is being redetermined to be a Berberis aquifolium. I know that might just be like a bunch of blah, blah, blah for a lot of you that don't follow botanical names, but those of you that do, once you learn a name doesn't mean that it's going to be that name forever. So I guess that's the long and short of it. Mahonia aquifolium, Berberis aquifolium, our standard Oregon grape is going to bloom in like January. So flower buds are up at the tips here, but not very exciting or attractive yet. I see them developing, but what we still see on this plant is the beautiful Oregon grape fruit that has been made from last year's flowers. And all of this fruit, as it kind of gets a little bit softer, is wonderful forage for area songbirds and, squirrels and that kind of thing. So still just as worthwhile on that note, and then it'll flower. In addition to our native Mahonia, we have, and here's another native, ouch. This is our creeping Oregon grape. Look how beautiful that plant is right now with this gorgeous kind of plum burgundy colored growth. Also will be flowering in January or February. This is Mahonia repens. So this is like a low creeping ground cover form of Oregon grape versus the aquifolium. Gets to be big. And then these two are cultivars of our Mahonia. So we've got Charity here, which you can see is just the whole top of Charity is a bunch of spikes of flower buds that will be in bloom within another month or so. Charity is very thorny, and so as I ouch my way through the table, the leaves at the ends of there's spikes at the ends of the leaves on Charity that make it not so nice to touch. On the other side of the scale from Charity is this Mahonia, which is actually named for the fact that it's not pokey. This is Mahonia Soft Caress. And see, you have to touch it when you say that just to demonstrate how nice it is. So Mahonia Soft Caress is already in bloom with this like acid yellow, chartreuse colored flower that not only supplies pollinators, but guess who comes all the way down to this low to the ground to grab a bite? Hummingbirds are all over this plant as well. So anything that blooms this time of year, camellias as well, the hummingbirds start to get a little less picky. Suddenly they're like, well, it doesn't have to be red and tubular, I guess. So, of course, they're also a lot of fun to see in the garden. And they do not hibernate, at least not our Anna's hummingbirds, so we get to watch them all year round. So Mahonias, Oregon grape in general. Witch hazel? Well, this hazel. Witch hazel here is starting to drop its leaves, but really puts on an absolutely gorgeous display of fall color that we can see ranging from, just going in deep under the pot. I have like a russet, orangey, almost towards purple color. This is like perfect yellow-orange split. And then, through the spring and summer, the leaves are green. So this is what's gone on over the last couple of weeks. But there are flower buds that again are tightly arranged along the branch of the witch hazel that will be blooming in late winter. So usually again, witch hazels are blooming end of December, early January. This is Jelena, I believe, which is just a mid-season bloomer, kind of an orange flower. Yeah, this is Jelena. But witch hazels are stringy in their flower form. They don't have like a flower that we would think of like, a flower. They're asymmetrical, they're stringy, they're kind of weird looking, but they're dusted with pollen. So they're like a to-go meal for a bee. I mean, they can just kind of fly through it and get what they need. Really easy access, not a lot of work for them to do. And that's the way a pollinator wants it when they're desperate for food and running on fumes at that time of year. Similar to witch hazel in its funny little fringe-like blooms is Sarcocoa. Sarcocoa, known as sweet box, is one of our like go-to sturdy workhorse evergreen shrubs in the landscape. Sarcocoa grows in shade. In addition to shade, it grows in dry shade, so under great big trees and things where you have a lot of struggle on other plants staying hydrated. Sarcocoa is pretty happy with that. This is Sarcocoa russifolia, so this is the taller form of the sweet box, but there's also a low-growing ground cover style. Both plants are evergreen, as I mentioned. They have buds on their stems right now that will be developing slowly as we go through the winter and open up, depending on the species, they'll be blooming anywhere from mid to late November on through, again, January. And sweet box is because they have a fragrant flower that is sweet, kind of honeysuckle sweet. Not real perfumey, but just a nice sweet scented flower. And it wafts in the air as it just warms up a little in the spring. And I swear it just beckons the pollinators in from far and wide. So very potent fragrance, although not, I always say, you're never going to call your friend up and be like, you've got to come see my Sarcocoa flower. It's just not a thing. But people will stand at your door if you have one planted nearby and just sniff and try to figure out where's that great smell coming from, because it's very inconspicuous other than to the nose. Manzanitas and strawberry trees, talked about those. Andromeda, another one of our common landscape plants. I mean, we have rhodies and azaleas and usually Andromeda. They're kind of part of a standard landscape kit in most cases. The Andromeda botanical name is Pieris japonica. Many of you may be familiar with it as string of pearls is one of the kind of common names. It's another one of our evergreen landscape shrubs that puts flower buds out this time of year. So they're kind of ornamental clusters of tiny little, I don't know, bally, stringy things at the ends of the branches. And those will be the flower buds that bloom in late winter, early spring, usually before the rhodies and the azaleas bloom. And man, are they always just full of bees. It's another bell-shaped flower, Ericaceae style bloom. And the little bee can just kind of get up inside the flower and just kind of bump around. They don't even have to be very exact. They can just sort of wander around in the flower and they get dusted with pollen and off they go. Many varieties of viburnum, which I mentioned, Viburnum burkwoodii is a great example of a early pollinator. Fall and winter blooming camellias. Here I have apple blossom, which is another beautiful single form. So our single flower where we've got all of that beautiful reproductive pollen available and easy to get in the center. We don't want to play hard to get when it comes to pollinating. And again, single petaled forms of anything over double petals or double flowers is preferred. I don't have our winter blooming vines in stock yet, but winter blooming jasmine, Jasmine nudiflorum, bright yellow flowers that are kind of tubular on kind of a green branched vine is Jasmine nudiflorum or winter jasmine, usually blooming right about now, so anywhere from November, December, January. And then starting to bloom usually in January and lasting until we get into like honest spring is the Clematis armandii or the evergreen clematis. Also fragrant, bell-shaped clusters of usually white or kind of creamy white ivory flowers, also available in a pink flower form known as apple blossom as well. So Clematis armandii, great evergreen screening vine, fast growing if you're looking for something to, cover your neighbor's whatever window or view of their RV or something like that. And then perennials. So many blooming perennials are not yet flowering in the early spring or late winter. A few that we have as examples that we all really know about because there are so few. One are the heaths and heathers. So we have Calluna, and this is one of my favorite Callunas. This is spring torch. So Calluna spring torch, which is budded and has little tiny flowers, Ericaceae flowers again. But spring torch flowers from like August through October or November. So it's at the tail end of its bloom. But then the Ericas, so this is Erica Kramer's Rote. Yes, it is. So Kramer's Rote is winter flowering. So it's full of flower buds now, but it'll actually bloom from like November through probably January or March. So heaths and heathers are both, usually it's the heaths that give us the early season bloom and the heathers that give us late season bloom. So combine them and you've got both kind of, the season is bookended with some flowers. Easy to care for, evergreen. We look at them as perennials, but they're sort of somewhere between like a woody subshrub and a perennial, if that makes any sense. Hellebores, like they are, gosh, I think one of their common names is Lenten rose or winter rose because hellebores are winter bloomers or early spring. The variety, I don't even have them flowering yet. There's just like, we can barely peek into the first little hellebore bloom here of pink frost. Yeah, here's pink frost. So we're just close enough that we can start to see them flowering. But there are hellebores that will bloom from November, a variety, for example, that blooms in November, and varieties of hellebores that won't bloom until more like March or April. So even just with hellebore selection, you can stretch out the flowering of the available flowering time in your garden from November through April with different species and cultivars of the hellebores. Again, evergreen, grow in part sun to mostly shade, easy care plants, containers or in the ground. Hellebores are great. And then right here, front and center, with their little blooms out right now, these are heucheras or coral bells. And I brought these up again because this is one of those perennials that has gone through quite a transition in the last couple of decades. The plant breeders have been having a lot of fun making really cool foliage patterns and colors. This is fire alarm. I don't know what it is. This is City Rio. See, there's so many varieties. This is Rio. This is Red Lightning. Nope, this is Delta Dawn. See, I don't even know. There's so many different varieties, and in most cases, they've been bred now more for their foliage, which is evergreen, colorful, kind of bold, and less for an attractive flower. But our grandmothers grew coral bells. My grandmother at least grew coral bells. I bet yours did too. And our grandmothers grew them for hummingbirds. And they were a green-leafed perennial with this really pretty little pink flower on this nice thin stem and sweet little easy to get bell-shaped pink flowers. Now, as the breeders worked on making the leaves really cool, they've lost a lot of the attractiveness of the flower to us, to the human eye. However, whether this little flower is attractive to you or not, it's quite scrumptious to a pollinator, ranging from native bees to even hummingbirds and moths in the evening or nighttime. So it's, again, gardening. Yeah, a lot of it is about us, but it's not always about us, and especially not if you are a pollinator gardener. The winter flower that most of us know kind of as the most common, probably, are pansies and violas. And many of us have been out planting pansies and violas in our kind of bedding areas or our flower beds near our porches, in pots by our front entry. And although they will continue to bloom through snow and ice and flower for you all winter long, the breeding that has been done on most pansies and violas has caused them to have relatively insignificant nutritional value to pollinators. So this is an example of a plant that's been hybridized so that the nectar tube has gotten too long for most little bees' tongues to get down in and get the nectar. And bees' tongues are long in the first place. Like, most bees' tongues are at least as long as their whole body, and in some cases even twice as long. And so to get your nectar tube to be too long, it's a little overboard, but that's why you don't often see a lot of pollinators buzzing around on pansies. What you can see occasionally are moths, and especially nighttime moths, will visit pansies, especially lighter colored pansies and violas. Sometimes they even have a light fragrance that helps the pollinators find their way. But you'll also occasionally see bumblebees. The great big bumblebees can actually use buzz pollination to dislodge pollen from the flower instead of going in to get it. And that's a sidetrack that I don't want to get too far on, but buzz pollination is super cool. So bumblebees are like big enough, right? They're like some of the biggest bees that we have. So they're big enough that when they land on a flower and use their wings, engage their wings to flap, they can vibrate the flower with their wing beat. And so they hang on and flap their wings, and they vibrate to the perfect frequency that the pollen, the apparatus that holds pollen inside the flower, suddenly just shakes all the pollen loose. And while the bumblebee is sitting there buzzing it, it suddenly just gets the payoff, and a big cache of pollen falls out on top of them. Must be a really cool experience. But so that's what you see when there's a bumblebee on a pansy flower, but usually you don't see any other types of bees on them. Now, native violas are a different story. So our native violas still have their little nectar spur in many cases on the back of the flower and haven't been overbred, so they can still, so native bees and pollinators still have enough anatomy to get in there and reach all of the goods that they want. The last one is cabbages and kales. Something that, again, you may have pansies, you may have cabbages and kales. Even if you don't have anything else in your garden, a simple container garden with a little ornamental kale and some pansies can still provide some pollinator habitat. And that is by allowing the cabbages and kales to go to flower at the end of their season. So the kale here is pretty obvious. This is dazzling blue kale, isn't it? Very pretty. And this is scarlet borer kale. So both of these are upright ornamental kales. Doesn't mean you couldn't eat them. This one looks a lot like lacinato, and this one looks a lot like, Siberian blue, but they're grown for ornamental. So we have our cabbages and kales, and then our more rosette style ornamental cabbages, all very familiar to many of us. This time of year, they look great. They're going to hold through the winter with cool color and attractive foliage. But as it warms up in early spring, both the little rosette style cabbages and the taller forming kale will get taller and kind of create this spike. It looks like it's suddenly decided to become a tree or a bush, and it starts to climb out of the center. And the center then slowly develops a yellow flower spike. And as those flowers bloom, they're one of the early things that are flowering that are very attractive and highly nutritious to native pollinators as well. So let your cabbages and kales go to flower before then when those flowers are spent and done, then you can cut them off and, compost and flip your container over for the next season. It'll all be at about the right time. The last thing said about your pollinator garden in general is do your best to group your winter and early spring flowering or pollinator attracting plants together and not have them spread out all over your garden. The reality is many pollinators have a very small range and would even keep their range smaller if they had options to stay in their little neighborhood and get all their food and resources they need than to go all across the garden to get the food. In addition to that, it is very hard work to be out there collecting when it is cold and wet. And so the easier we can make it for our foragers, the less energy they expend keeping themselves warm and mobile in the act of collecting nutrition for further energy and sustenance. So that being said, group them together, leave the leaves, have an untidy patch of ground. Think about whether or not you have any kind of nectar or pollen supply for your winter pollinators. You can also come down and plant a couple of spring flowering bulbs this time of year, things like crocus, snowdrops, all also very early blooming and beneficial to our area pollinators. I hope this has been a good class for you all. It's kind of a new topic, so I'm working it out, but if there are any questions that I did not cover, please give them in the comments and I will be sure to answer them afterwards. Thanks so much. Happy gardening.